All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is Zach Moonshine with Metal Devastation Radio, and on the phone with me right now I have Paul Ryan from Cradle of Filth. How you doing today, Paul?
Yeah, I'm good, man. How are you?
All right, man, I'm doing good. So tell us what's going on in the world of Cradle of Filth.
Well, currently we're doing a bunch of press for the latest release, which is a retrospective.
Hello, Paul.
Hey, man, you cut out there for a minute, or I cut out there for a minute. I don't know how much of that you got.
Well, you were just about to go into the reissue that you guys just did.
Sure. Well, basically, yeah. I mean, we're doing a bunch of press this week for TFD, Total Fucking Darkness, which was the band's third demo, which is a retrospective release and a kind of celebration, really, of the time, because it's all the stuff that led us to get signed for Principle of Evil Made Flesh and the band's first album, and it's an integral part of that record. It was the prequel to a lot of the actual material that's on there. You know, Black Goddess is on there, and you know it was all very relevant at the time to what we were writing. And it was through a chance meeting between Danny and myself, between a mutual friend of ours. We had some dinner together. And Danny and I have always stayed in touch, but and I've always stayed working within music. I'm a booking agent these days, and I've been a promoter, and have stayed very much in the scene. And we've seen each other at festivals and a few other places over the years, but we hadn't really kind of had a proper conversation in many, many years. And when we were talking about the time and the fact it was the 20th anniversary of Principle, et cetera, we were saying how fun it would be to kind of try and do something. And then another mutual friend of ours, we both had similar conversations with, where he was suggesting that because it was the 20th anniversary that we should look at re-releasing this demo, because he had the master tapes and he had, there was a lot of stuff around the time that we all had, like, rehearsal tapes, and there was other material that didn't get released. So that's how the actual release came around, is through that meeting. And then we got together, and once we pooled our resources, we came up with some pretty interesting material.
Yeah. Well, the sound quality on this is it's badass. It sounds really, really good.
Thank you.
What can you tell me about were you guys there with the engineers and whatnot when you were remastering it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Dan and I have curated this release because, like I say, when we went round to Niall Cacophonous, who signed the band in the first place, he was an integral part of that whole entire kind of Cacophonous like album, with that and Vampire, and later on with all the Dust stuff as well. And it was all kind of interlinked at the time. Now, when we sat down with each other, I went to my mother's house and Dan went to his parents' houses, and we literally went up and rooting around in lofts for boxes of old cassettes. When we sat down and pulled the kind of resources that we had, we're literally sitting there with a pile of old tapes of all this rare stuff, and a lot of it was actually in fairly good condition. A lot of it was actually sounded pretty good. Two things in particular. The first track on the release is actually from Reissue, which was an album we recorded before Principle,
yes.
Which didn't get released and subsequently got lost. Well, I say got lost, it got wiped. Long story short, there we got signed by a label called Tombstone, which then ceased to exist after we came out of the studio. Couldn't pay the studio bill. And at the time, the engineers were like, well, if you're not going to pay for the tape, we're going to wipe it. We're an unknown band. No one knew who we were. And so the only record we had of that album, sadly, was one song that we had on a cassette. And that cassette is one of the things that Danny had found. And there was a rehearsal there that we found. We were very meticulous in recording our rehearsals. And that was one of the interesting things to look back on, was to kind of look at how meticulous we were at recording things. And therefore we're sitting there with 10, 20 tapes of all this rehearsal stuff. And we had this real gem of a rehearsal that, to be honest, sounded as good as the demo. And that was one of the other things we used on this. So when we went in to master it, both Danny and I sat down and we were very particular about the way we wanted it to sound. I'm pleased that you're pleased with the end results. It does sound really good. But to put it into perspective for people, the actual demo itself was recorded on an old 8-track machine in a caravan in a field. And when you listen to this and think that we literally, it's gone from that to us sitting there with a bunch of tapes around someone's house, and then we're going into the mastering studio and actually coming out with the results we've got. I think we've got a lot to thank modern recording technology for, because it's got the ability these days to come in and clean a lot of stuff up. So I think it sounds fantastic.
Yes, definitely. I'm going to be thinking about that next time I listen to it too.
Yeah, well, literally in a caravan on a rainy day in a field, and to the point where, without boring people of the way techniques are, that if they're not familiar with them, I mean, because it was only 8 tracks, there was no digital recording, so we didn't have infinite amounts of time to do stuff, or the ability to lay stuff over. So the music was recorded 90% live, and then there was a few guitar overdubs, and we were actually bouncing down the guitar tracks and the bass track together as it was being recorded. So down onto a stereo pair. So we literally, it was like, the music that people are hearing is pretty much the band playing live. There was, and then a few vocal overdubs, and that was pretty much it.
Wow, that is metal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. You had to play back. You had to play back then. There's no way of disguising if you were terrible or not.
Right. Looking back at that time, what can you tell me about what the scene was like when you guys first were doing all that?
It was pretty cool, man. I mean, it felt exciting. I mean, look, we were young. I mean, especially when we did TFD, I think I was probably 16, 17 at the time, and my brother was maybe 15. The drummer was 15. Danny was maybe 18. I think Paul Lander was probably 18, 19 as well. So we were all really young, but so you take a lot of stuff for granted. However, there was something in the water back then. You could just sense things were happening. And certainly from a kind of a musical standpoint, being a fan of all of it and still being a fan today, I mean, the amount of albums that came out late 80s, early 90s, it was just golden time, and we were literally bathing in it. It was all these albums coming out that we were into. It was a very exciting time.
What were your main influences, and what bands really got you guys into metal?
Well, I mean, we had a lot of influences. I mean, around that particular time, one of the bands that really kind of got to us was about a Dutch band called The Gathering, which people probably know. But the first album, Always, that was a big influence with us, because it was the first kind of death metal thing we'd heard that had keyboards. And also Gothic by Paradise Lost was a big influence on us at the time from the symphonic aspect, because it was something that people just weren't doing. So that kind of blew our mind a little bit. And then we were coming in from, the main background with all of us really was the kind of, which people may or may not kind of know, is from the punk and hardcore background. We used to go to a bunch of the early kind of grindcore shows with like Carcass and Napalm Death and a lot of the grind stuff, and that was the stuff at the time in the scene that we were really kind of going to. And then that evolved into death metal, which evolved into black metal. So there was a lot of bands like Napalm Death and Repulsion were as big of an influence on us as, like I say, about The Gathering and Paradise Lost. But there again, when Burzum and Dark Throne and all the kind of second wave of black metal stuff came in, that was a big influence. But we were really into Bathory and Celtic Frost and all the first wave of stuff. So because of, I don't know how old you are, but certainly between 87 and 93, it was happening so quick. It was, now when you look back on it, it's a lot more separated. Yeah. Back then, it was a mishmash of all this stuff evolving really quickly. So it was almost like the influences were coming from all over the place. And I think you mix that in with a bunch of young teenagers that are like totally obsessed with all of it, that can play a little bit of music, and the end results on what happened with Cradle, really. Yeah, no, I remember. I'm part of that generation too. Yeah, well, it's a good time back then. And you can't help but talk about it without sounding like an old git these days, but it was a really cool time. And I think because it hadn't existed before, there was no sense of anything being generic, because it was evolving as we were seeing it. And that in itself, that's the one thing I'd never took for granted, is that, the first time you heard a blast beat, or the first time you heard people properly screaming, that was something that I just knew that was special, because I just, it was a sense of discovery, which to a certain extent I think people get these days. I'm not saying the kids are jaded and they don't have any sense of discovery. Of course they do. But there was no history with that stuff, so you couldn't reference it to anything. So you knew it was something that was a little bit unique. Definitely. Yeah, I know when I was looking over the info on the reissue, and I seen the date, I think it was 91.
I was thinking immediately, I was like, God, has it been that long already?
I know. Scarily, the last 20 years for me has gone in an eye blink, and I'm sure that's the same for most people. But and I think it also is that I still listen to a lot of the same stuff. I'm a big advocate of contemporary music. I work with a lot of contemporary music, and I'm a real I love discovering things, discovering new bands. But I think that on a personal level as well, there's albums. There's a lot of albums from that time that have stayed with me that I still listen to, and that's not because I don't want to evolve, but it's because they're so bloody good, to be honest. And a lot of stuff, like I'm a big Death fan. I listen to an album like Spiritual Healing. I have listened to that album day in, day out since it came out, and I still listen to it on a weekly basis. Still listen to Rain in Blood every week. Still listen to there's a ton of albums that throughout my week I've got to listen to them. That's been no different since I was 15. But there again, there's a lot of new stuff that I have that feeling for as well.
I think the same can be said for a lot of us from that generation. I don't know what it is, but there was just something about those albums that we all heard when we were that age that it just sticks with you,
Absolutely. And I hope that the kind of more contemporary and modern generation of people get that with albums they listen to these days. And I'm sure they probably, I'm sure people probably do and probably will. But I think certainly from back then, there was something very special in the water back then.
Yeah, definitely. One thing I wanted to ask you, the name itself, Cradle of Filth. That is one badass band name. I've always thought that from the very beginning. How did you guys come up with that?
Well, you know what? And I'm sure if you ask Danny the same question, he will tell you the same. It actually came from the back of a jacket. There was a band called Icons of Filth around at the time, like a punk band, and there was a crust punk guy that we saw, and he had some kind of speech on his jacket, and it was said blah blah something in a Cradle of Filth, and that was literally Danny saw that. And we were like, oh, yeah, that'd make a really cool band name. And really, it kind of it happened as simple as that. It came from the back of a punk guy's jacket. And obviously, the connotations of it spoke for themselves. We knew at the time, especially being into a lot of the darker music, we were like, yeah, that's cool. And of course, it's got scope to kind of explore the darker side of things that we're all into.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly where I first saw that. It was probably in a magazine or something, but I do remember it grabbed my attention right away. I kept thinking, what the fuck is this? This has to be badass.
Well, I think it's funny how people kind of get these names, and it amazes me a lot of the band names that kind of come up now. And then you ask, you see things in interviews with people, and you ask them where they got them from, especially some of the kind of deep and meaningful names that people have, and then you find out, yeah, so I kind of saw it here, or I saw it there, or this was, it fitted in. Interesting to find out where these things come from, for sure.
That leads me into another question. One thing I've always loved about you guys is the T-shirts, man.
Yes.
Like almost every festival I've ever been to, I always see the back of T-shirts with Jesus is a cunt and shit like that. I've always loved that, and I've always thought that's it's genius. But I mean, who comes up with all these T-shirt ideas?
I mean, look, it's one of those things that I think that the time I was in the band was a time where a lot of that stuff was happening, and I know that there's something that we're all really keen on, is that we wanted to make a statement with those shirts. We didn't want to we just thought it was boring to have all you'd see at the time would be album T-shirts, and maybe something on the back, maybe something not. And I'm not saying that Cradle started off that kind of whole slogan and shock value to the shirts, but it kind of just seemed a natural thing to be doing. Certainly when it came to the kind of religious connotations or making a statement to kind of shock in that sense, it just seemed like a bit of a golden opportunity to be able to stick something on the back of a shirt that people would, it was almost like we were all between us thinking of the most offensive thing we could. What's the most offensive thing we can have on the back of a shirt that people's parents not only won't want to wash, but won't want to even have it in the house? We were actually standing outside of the marquee seeing a gig once, Danny and myself and Paul Lander and a few other people, and we all had the Jesus shirts on. And I remember we were all standing there feeling very proud of ourselves, and people kind of going, oh, look at those shirts, and it was all very kind of very cool. And then a policeman came along and he was like, take your shirts off. And we got made. None of us had any T-shirts on. We had T-shirts on, nothing on underneath. So we literally got made to take our T-shirts off, turn them inside out, and then put them back on in the queue. And I always remember looking back at that thinking, yeah, after that, we didn't feel quite as clever about it. But the fact it invoked that kind of reaction. One of the last tours that I did with the band, it's been about in about 1995, was with Malevolent Creation and Vader, I think. And I'm pretty sure it was that tour that we played a gig next door to the Vatican. And, the police came in halfway through the gig and tried to stop the gig. And you can imagine what they must have thought when they came in there and saw all these shirts everywhere. So, going back to what I was saying before, we came from a bit of almost like a punk rock background in that sense. Certainly, that way of provocation and the way that scene kind of has that thing. Maybe that's the other influence in it. Maybe because we weren't coming from so much of a metal scene as more of a kind of punk hardcore scene. That whole anarchic pushing people for a reaction, pushing the system in that sense. Maybe that's where it kind of came from in that whole ethos, really.
Yeah, definitely, like a big middle finger.
Yeah, definitely, to society and the system and everything. I think it's like, something something I've always identified too. I mean, I've always liked being able to look the way I like, and even though I've been working as a booking agent, the promoter and stuff, which would be deemed as, in brackets, a proper job, it doesn't feel like work. I'm still going into, my office has loads of different kind of plaques on the wall, or posters of gigs and whatever else in it. Well, that's no different to when I was 15. When I was 15 years old, I was in my parents' bedroom with like pictures of Slayer and Exodus and Bathory up on the wall everywhere, and I'm still coming into the office listening to music with just different shit on the wall, but it's the same situation really. So
yeah, that definitely doesn't change.
No,
you're making me think about it. I'm looking around, I got posters everywhere too, so it's just the same.
You live and breathe it, man. It's part of you.
Looking back at your career, what would you say is some of the best highlights that you can remember?
Well, I think, obviously Cradle themselves have had loads of highlights. I mean, in the earlier times, certainly for the first kind of 3 records with Empire and Dusk and Principle, I mean, it was just a real whirlwind of, touring and, press that was going on at the time and everything. I think post that with, Cruelty and Midian and the later albums, the band, I think, has always enjoyed a very steady kind of platform to work from, and a very kind of, an interesting career in the sense of there's been generations of people coming through getting into the band. And I think from my perspective, looking at that and being involved with music still like I am, that's lovely to see. And it's nice to, exactly like you say, it's nice to be at a festival and see a shirt and see a shirt and see a shirt. That's a kind of cool thing, seeing that influence going around. So I think they've had a very fruitful career, and the band's still going strong. I know the last tour they recently did with Behemoth in Europe was a real success, and there's still a very solid fan base there for it. I mean, the reaction we've had to TFD has been fantastic. We meant it as, we've done it as a low-key release. That's why it's gone through Mordgrim, and why it's been a very much like grassroots level release in that sense. There hasn't been a big team of people at a record label working with it. There hasn't been like a press officer or anything that's been contrived around what's been going on. We wanted to do it as a very organic kind of, stick it out there. The people that are interested, like yourselves and magazines and everything else, we'll put it out to everybody. And if people want to get involved with it, great. And if people want to celebrate it for what it is, great. And if not, no worries. And the reaction has been fairly overwhelming, to be honest.
Yeah, well, we're definitely going to be playing it here on Metal Devastation. That's for sure.
Thank you. Well, that's great. I mean, from my perspective as well, getting back into doing a bit of press on this kind of stuff, and certainly curating the release with Dan has been thoroughly rewarding and enjoyable, because it's just something that we can really kind of indulge in, really. And it still amazes me now, 20 odd years on, that you can, be involved with this kind of music and put something out there that people actually give a shit about, versus it being some commercial pop release,
Yeah, definitely. What would you say is the craziest thing you've ever seen a fan do?
An interesting one. I think that people cutting themselves, maybe. So the stuff that I used to see when I was in the band regarding this period in time, you'd see people cutting themselves. You'd see people, coming to shows covered in blood. You'd see all sorts of crazy stuff now that you wouldn't normally probably see. see people in the audience lighting candles and dripping wax over themselves, like screaming into it, all sorts of crazy stuff. But nothing. I say nothing too extreme. People might see that as extreme at a gig. I don't know. I mean, I've never gone to a gig with a candle and kind of, dripped it into my own mouth while screaming myself. But it's each their own. But that kind of stuff really. But we were in that kind of throw of that whole kind of black metal, death metal, kind of, cloud at the time, so people were really taken into it. I mean, I think that certainly show wise at the time back then, there was something in the air. There was a certain amount of possession, I would say, with the way people were at gigs versus how they probably are these days. And I think you do see people get obsessed at gigs, and you see people at the front row and everything go crazy for it. But there was definitely something a little bit more almost sinister in the air back then. It was almost like people were being taken in by a spell. Contrived that might sound, but it was certainly at the time then that was the case.
Yeah, I definitely understand what you mean. Well, Paul, I guess I'm about out of questions here. What would you like to tell all your fans and listeners out there listening?
Well, I'd just like to say to people, thanks for supporting the release. And if people enjoy it, that's absolutely fantastic. If people enjoy it half as much as we have getting it all together, then great. And, for people that are interested in things that were going on at the time, I think new fans, old fans, whatever, it's just a really interesting window into a period of time that was a very special time for a lot of people, and hopefully people take some enjoyment out of it, and we appreciate their support.
Cool. Awesome, man. You guys got any plans for the future with touring or anything?
Yeah, the band's basically recording a new record, and I would say to people just to look out on the website and the Facebook and stuff for activity moving forward. Awesome.
All right, Paul, well, before I let you go, can I get you to make me a station tag?
Absolutely, mate. Not a problem at all.
All right. Say, this is Paul from Cradle of Filth, and you're listening to Metal Devastation Radio.
This is Paul Ryan from Cradle of Filth.